Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter.
Hi there guys, it's Adam Martin here and welcome back to another video, and today we're talking about TV and raising the question, who is TV even for anymore? I think this question has been prevalent in the media world for quite some time now, particularly during the 2020s as they've gone on. What's prompted me to talk about it is seeing this article from RxTV. As always, go and check them out. Lots of great stuff, a lot of stuff that I don't cover here on this channel. If you're into media, you'll like this. And it raised the question, older Brits left behind by TV, according to new research. Now, that is quite the provocative title, implying that the older generations aren't being served by television anymore. Is there any truth to that? Well, let's get straight into it and find out. It says a new study from Great, the Freeview channel network that's owned by Narrative Entertainment, has shed light on a growing disconnect between UK broadcasters and their most loyal audience, the nation's 22 million over 55s. Keep in mind, that's almost, what is that now? It's maybe not a third exactly, but it's not far off from a third of the population, I think. According to the Upper Third report, more than 1 in 4 viewers in this age group, 26% of them, feel sidelined by today's TV producers and advertisers. This sentiment is especially striking given that over 55s watch more television than any other demographic, clocking in at an average of 3 hours and 42 minutes per day. And the reasons for that may seem very obvious. Those who are over 55, so to just go that on a date perspective, 55 takes you back to 1970. If you grew up then or even before, television was the main way that you consumed entertainment at home, at least visual entertainment. You know, you may have gone to the cinema, listened to your records and stuff, but at home, the TV was the main entertainment center. And that was the case throughout the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and even for much part of the noughties. But essentially, I think if you're in that demographic, the routine of sitting down to turn on the television, find a channel, watch your content is very much ingrained in those generations. I know people within my family who fall into this demographic, and they still do watch a lot of television, particularly when compared to myself, someone who's not in that demographic, and a lot of my friends. The report also reveals a strong national appetite for nostalgic programming, with 67% of Brits saying that they enjoy watching classic TV. Among them, men aged 55 to 64 are the most enthusiastic, with a remarkable 76% expressing a preference for retro shows. I mean, I think the appetite for classic TV has been around for a long time, and now you are getting certain TV channels that skew deliberately to that older content. Think of like Rewind TV that launched within the last year. That really does put a focus on that older content, and a lot of people have sung the praises of that. And even when the main broadcasters like the BBC, ITV, etc., when they show classic shows, it often gets a lot of enthusiasm, particularly if it's for like a special occasion or if we're celebrating an anniversary and stuff like that. And it's the programs that those demographics, the over 55s, they grew up with them, and in many cases they might not have seen them for years, because you've got to think back in the 70s and 80s, home video was relatively new. Not everything got released on home video, and stuff that was, for a time, it was quite expensive to own it on VHS or beta or whatever format you were going for at the time. So the chance now to watch that stuff after potentially decades will hold a lot of appeal. I think there's no doubt about that. And I see more and more that the main broadcasters are dabbling with showing older stuff on the schedules. I know ITV tends to show classic Corrie. I think that's over on ITV3. The BBC occasionally shows something retro. But I think the retro TV channels, like I mentioned about Rewind, they're really scratching that itch for those who want that old programming. Yet many of these viewers feel increasingly alienated by current programming trends. Half of the over 55s believe that today's TV schedules are skewed towards younger audiences, favouring reality formats over the timeless dramas and comedies that they grew up with. In fact, 2/3 of mature viewers, 66% of them, say they feel more emotionally connected to the shows of yesteryear than to modern offerings, and they're eager to see more classics return to their screens. I think it's a bit difficult, isn't it? Because they're more emotionally connected to the shows of yesteryear than modern offerings. I think that would be the case even for younger generations. Like, take myself, right? I'm just shy of 30 years old, and just an immediate example I can think of, the 2005 to 2010 era of Doctor Who, that was my childhood. I grew up with that. I have a very deep emotional connection to that era, a lot more than many of the other eras of the show. It may not even be my overall favorite era of the show, but just the sheer fact that I have that connection says a lot, much more than I do to the modern offerings. And that's not me trying to slight the modern stuff, but my connection to that era, that 2005 to 2010, is a lot deeper. And of course, I'd love to see that return to the screen. I'd love to see that in a heartbeat. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that emotional connection is universal across various demographics, no matter how old you are. If you had an emotional connection with the show when you were younger, whether that was in the 70s, 80s, whenever it was, then of course you're going to want to see it back. So I'm not saying it's a moot point on these people who feel that connection and want to see them back, but I just think it applies to more than just the mature viewership as it's being put here. And as to these who believe that content is being skewed towards younger audiences, I mean, they're between a rock and a hard place. They kind of have to a degree. Television watching amongst the younger demographics is down. We can all agree on that. I'm just shy of 30 years old. I don't watch all that much television. I don't watch much live. I don't watch much on catch-up. I did when I was a kid, when the internet was still relatively in its infancy and coming along. Television was my main source of viewing, and I would watch a lot of content. But through the 2010s and particularly into the 2020s, the appetite to do that just isn't there anymore. It hasn't become as engraved into me as it would have been someone who spent 20, maybe 30 years with that as their sole option. TV's trying to get that younger viewership because they want to remain, well, partly relevant, but it's also just hanging on. If the older audience is the sole audience watching television, that's great, and you could cater to them for a time. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when those older audiences eventually pass on, when the television generation, if you like, when that all goes away, what are you left with? The viewers who are left, the younger generations, are you going to get them to watch television? No, of course you aren't. What I'm trying to get at is when the television generation dies off, the younger generations aren't going to be naturally drawn to it because they'll have been raised, and by then, decades on, of streaming or via YouTube or various other means, and then television in that traditional sense may die off for good. So I understand why broadcasters are trying to aim content towards younger audiences, like you have the reality programming. What does annoy me a little bit is you see, what was the most recent example? It was that Honeymoon Island thing that was on BBC One. Now, there's been reality content on BBC One before, but considering how many television channels the BBC has, particularly with BBC Three right there, which still claims to be aimed at like the young adult market, the fact that you had this, reality-based show like Honeymoon Island on BBC One just felt a bit misplaced. The main core audience ship of BBC One are not going to be tuning into Honeymoon Island, and I believe in terms of the ratings, it didn't do all that well. So I can understand why the mature viewers are a bit annoyed about the schedules being tailored to younger audiences, but really I think from a business standpoint and from trying to keep television in that traditional sense going, again, I can see why the broadcasters are doing it. It says, despite the demand for older content, the 5 main terrestrial channels aired just 9 classic shows in the past week, less than 5% of total programming. This article was published in the early September, so in that first week, only 9 classic shows in the past week from those 5 main terrestrial channels. Now, keep in mind, that's covering BBC One, BBC Two, ITV1, Channel 4, and Channel 5. These are the flagship channels of these different broadcasters, and I can totally understand for your flagship channel, you want to keep focus on older, classic content to a minimum. I can completely understand that. You want to focus on new programs, stuff that you're putting money into, stuff that you want to see do well, get that audience ship in, get them to watch, get them to keep watching future programs. I understand why those 5 in particular are so scant on classic programs in particular. What it doesn't take into account is all the other channels. Is there classic content being shown on BBC's 2, 3, and 4? What about ITV 2, 3, and 4? Or the various Channel 4 offshoots like E4 or the various other ones there? Channel 5 has its offshoots as well. But I think, yes, the 5 main terrestrial broadcasters, it's less than 5% of total programming, but from their standpoint, I can understand it. I can see why that is. But then I guess the 5 main terrestrial channels are what those mature viewers may default to. I'm not saying everyone does, but I know people within my family, they tend to stick to what's on those main broadcasters, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, particularly those 5 main channels. So I can see why they're important in that sense. But I think with the range of access now to other channels that are even available on Freeview, that millions and millions of people use, things like Rewind TV and other examples, I think the options to branch out are there. So it also provides a counter-argument. It should be pointed out that the BBC often faces criticism from tabloids for airing too many repeats. This is something we talked about before. Mainstream audiences still expect fresh content from major broadcasters. This expectation does, however, raise an opportunity for the likes of narrative entertainment to cater to underserved viewers hungry for nostalgia. Yes, absolutely, this is what it gets. The BBC, and others to be fair, do air a lot of repeats. And a lot of those repeats aren't necessarily of quote-unquote classic shows, not stuff from way back, not from the 70s or 80s. It'll often air repeats of stuff that aired last week or last month. Do you know what I mean? It's a schedule filler. I can understand why they do it. But yes, it does make opportunities for groups like Narrative Entertainment that run the great series of channels, or Rewind TV, or a bunch of other channels that show older programming, to dive in and fill that niche. And why wouldn't you? You've got a ready-made audience who are hungry for it, who are desperate for it. So why not put programs on that will serve them? I think that makes complete sense. I don't think there's any, minds blown with that one. There's additional findings from the report which include representation gaps are stark. 39% of over 75s feel erased from TV, and 89% of women over 75 say portrayals are negative. So I'm assuming this is in terms of characters. Adverts also misrepresent older viewers. 57% see lazy stereotypes, while 60% say they're shown too much end-of-life content. That's a fair point, actually. The few times I've seen the advertisement, I have seen some end-of-life stuff, which probably isn't the most morale-boosting thing when you're in your later stages of life. And the lazy stereotypes thing, we've all seen it for, if it's an advert for a phone or something tech-related, and the older person just doesn't understand technology, when in fact, a lot of older people do understand technology and adapt really well. I think it's sort of picking the minority of the stereotypes and amplifying it. And yes, in terms of advertising that, it does need to do better. You could argue that needs to happen across various demographics. Then it's saying TV is a vital companion. 45% of over 55s rely on it for company, especially women aged over 75. Now, yes, I can attest to this absolutely. My dear grandmother, who passed not too long ago, she lived to be well over 100, but she spent several decades living on her own. Now, she was very sociable. She'd visit family, friends around where she lived. But in terms of, in her house, she was living on her own and would often have the TV on or the radio on a lot of the time, I think partly for that company. So yes, I can understand the importance TV or traditional TV has in that sense. But I think when you want to watch it for company, I understand wanting to watch programs that you feel more catered to. You don't want to be watching the latest reality show or, influencer-based stuff. You want stuff that's going to make you feel cozy or, feel good about yourself. And then broadcast TV remains popular because of habit. Yes, we talked about that. Comfort and ease of access, with many rejecting the overwhelming choice of streaming. And that is something to consider when it comes to streaming, as convenient as it can be. There is so much choice, not just with the provider you get for your smart TVs or packages or whatever, but in terms of your Netflixes, your Disney Plus, your Amazon Primes. We've talked about this ad nauseum before, but there is so much choice. The market is so saturated. There's a breadth of content. So much of it, you're never going to get a full list of what's on it and what's not. You'd be going with it for specific reasons. Whereas broadcast TV, like it says, it's habitual for these older generations. There's an ease of access on it. You turn your TV on, you flick down the channel guide, you pick a channel, boom, you're away. I can understand that. The marketing director for Great, Kate Gartland, commented, Britain's most loyal TV viewers are not young, and so they're being routinely ignored by modern-day broadcasters. Our core audiences are telling us loud and clear they feel left behind and want somewhere to watch their favourite shows, and that's exactly what we're giving them at Great. We curate our channels to celebrate the shows our audiences want, just how they want them. TV's for entertainment, for bringing people together, and often for providing company. We offer TV that fits right in. It shouldn't be all Love Island, first dates, and prioritising Gen Z. Older audiences are important and they should be catered for. And yes, on the whole, I agree with that sentiment. older audiences are important, and yes, they should be catered for just as much as younger audiences can be important, and they need to be catered for. The bottom line is it's a very difficult balance, particularly for the most prominent channels and broadcasters, the ones we mentioned, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5. They're trying to straddle a fine line of serving audiences who've been with them for decades, and also trying to serve audiences who are maybe new to these channels or don't often watch the channels in the first place. Again, it's a very, very difficult line they are trying to straddle. Not an easy one, not one I envy, and I'm sure one they, it's basically throw stuff at the wall at every day because it is so difficult to serve. Great is doing a decent thing, as are some of these other channels. Giving audiences shows that they want is going to scratch that itch, fit that niche for those older generations. I believe it's readily accessible on Freeview and a lot of other platforms as well, so it's not going to be too difficult for them to find, and it does cater to them. But I think whilst you can offer this criticism at the main broadcasters, absolutely, because you do have to balance for everybody, I do think you have to take stock of the role that they have as well, and the tightrope that all 5 of those main channels are trying to walk to serve pretty much everybody, or as many people as they can. But I think it's great in the ecosystem we have the channels like From the Great Network, like Rewind, etc., so that there is that option there ready-made available. But it does speak to this ultimate question: who is TV for nowadays? Is it for the older Brits? Is it for the younger Brits? I'm specifically talking about in the UK. Who is it for? I think a lot of people on the street would tell you, in terms of watching TV the traditional way, that's something their parents do, their grandparents, those who grew up with TV all their lives. Younger generations, like my generation and the ones younger than me, they don't really go for that. They go for the streaming option, they go for YouTube, and that's just the way things have turned. And obviously, the more of those generations that come into being and the less of the older generations, that's where you're going to see that shift. That's why the broadcasters are so desperate to get rid of Freeview and move to the freely option, the future, as it were. That's why they're all focusing on their streaming efforts. That's why there's all so much talk of winding down traditional channels over the next few years. That's why this is all happening. As the generational shift occurs, TV is going to become less, you could argue, for the older ones because they'll eventually pass on, but it's not necessarily going to become for the newer ones. And if that's the case, if TV went all gung-ho, serve those older Brits who want to watch it, but then who's it going to be for after that? It's going to be this odd little medium that was really prevalent, but then will go on to a future where it will serve no core audience and arguably maybe have no specific purpose. And I'm talking about traditional television. People will still buy TVs and watch things on TVs, but that thing of turning your TV on, scrolling the channel guide and watching something, in the traditional sense, I don't think it's going to be for anybody in a good few decades if the right measures aren't already put into place to serve all the kinds of audiences. And that's why it's so difficult. That's why those 5 main channels have it so hard. But that is all for this video. Thank you very much for watching. But I want to know your thoughts. Who do you think TV is for in 2025? Do you think it's for the older generations, the younger ones? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Also, leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. We'd love to have you aboard. We do various unscripted videos like this, but as well as the mini documentaries that are coming here and there on the channel as well. Love to have you aboard, so do hit subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Sean Knock, Dord Khan, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Liam Domain, AJ Mac 200017, Jen, Traffy, Mr. Eurovision 1986, Evan Hart 42 Radio, Tim Ripley, 40-something Manchild, Mr. J McLeod, James Wallace, Ben, Stephen Oliver, Shadow Fiend 180X, Swan Ronson, Adam Gamer, Sir Fonzie Daz, Tegan, Matthew Elliff, Pigeon's House, Seraphic Euphoria, Dave Batten, Leonard Starbuck, Kevin Mallon, Seed Diffusion, and Liam Turner, our AMTV staff members.